The title of this brief podcast is Recognizing Community, the Failure of American Drug Addiction Policy, and how a unique figure has emerged named Vivek Murthy, who's seeking to answer our failures by looking at community. American drug and mental health policy is a matter of people explaining why it has failed for the last 50 years, but it's still right. We have more mental disability, more deaths, more suicides, more deaths by drugs. It reminds me of Christianity in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages went from roughly 500 to 1500, and they were never seriously endangered. Everybody was on board. And you sort of say, well, it was such a great time. Poverty was rampant. There were a few wealthy people. There were constant warfare. Disease was rampant. There were witch trials. You got burned at the stake. But in a strange way, everybody was satisfied because everybody understood where things stood and where they fit in things. And I believe we're in a similar period currently in regards to drug and addiction policy. And I'm going to begin this podcast with a quote from a man named Norman Garmese. We stand on the threshold of advances in the biological sciences so relevant to psychopathology that one can look forward in the decades ahead to an ultimate resolution of the major psychotic disorders and addiction that have plagued mankind for centuries. Wow, that is such great news. Norman Garmese wrote that in 1975. So we're going on 50 years with that vision. I always imagine when I win my Nobel Prize, I'll read that quote and I'll ask everybody in the audience what they think of it. And I think everybody in the audience will raise their hand and say, I agree with it. Vivek Murthy has had an unusual experience. He was the Surgeon General and under Obama, and he was the 19th Surgeon General, and now he's the 21st Surgeon General under Biden, and he remained Surgeon General for a while under Trump. So when he was a Obama Surgeon General, he issued one of those reports that you're obligated to issue. About how addiction and mental illness are diseases like diabetes. You just have to do that. And health misinformation is a serious threat to public health, he said. It can cause confusion, sow mistrust, harm people's health, and undermine public health efforts. And so he wanted everybody to know not to be down on people with mental illness and addiction, that they're public health and disease issues. Now, the only slight problem with all of that is that they haven't improved in all of this time. And so he's come back, he left being Surgeon General, and he wrote a book. And the book was about communities, and it was reflected some personal experience because he wrote it during the pandemic, and he was separated from the community, the public health community that he had been a part of as Surgeon General. And he is a brilliant man, and he also has an outsider's perspective. I believe he's English, came to the United States, I think, to go to Harvard and Yale. He might be, I think, of Indian nationality. But there's often a danger when you come from an outside perspective that you'll just get usurped into the current perspective. For example, Biden's drug czar is named Rahul Gupta, who was a radical Secretary of Public Health in West Virginia. And they brought him in saying, well, he's going to institute a whole new harm reduction approach. That's what they said in 2022 when he was appointed. But that hasn't happened. But maybe I'm over investing my hope in Vivek Murthy. But he's come out in his second stint with a whole different way of thinking about addiction and mental illness. Our epidemic of loneliness and isolation has been an underappreciated public health crisis that has harmed individual and societal health. Our relationships are a source of healing and well-being hiding in plain sight, one that can help us live healthier, more fulfilled, and more productive lives. Given the significant health consequences of loneliness and isolation, we must prioritize building social connection the same way we have prioritized other critical public health issues such as tobacco, obesity, and substance use disorders. I would say we failed to deal with substance use disorders because we failed to do this. Together, we can build a country that's healthier, more resilient, less lonely, and more connected. Wow, that's ambitious. Now, who has disconnected us? Well, Murthy himself was a disease guy. I've spoken before about Thomas Insel, who's head of the National Institute of Mental Health, who invested billions of dollars in neurological approaches to mental illness. Then when he left his job in 2017, he said, nothing we've done has helped. Mental illness has gotten worse. We don't have really one cure. We wasted billions of dollars. Nora Volkow's still in office. She's still pushing the same, let's develop antibodies that'll fight off cocaine addiction. She thinks we're going to cure cocaine addiction with injections. And to a remarkable extent, people in the drug policy reform movement, like Maya Solovitz and Ethan Nadelman, view addiction in very much the same way. They're all great believers in medications for substance use treatment, for opioid use disorders, MOUD. Vivek Murthy has really cut up for himself a remarkable policy. He's going to try and tackle American social isolation. And he lays out a framework. He's laid out a framework for a, quote, national strategy to advance social connection, which he says has never been implemented before in the United States. Wow. He's not shying away from the big problems. His policy paper details recommendations for policies that will encourage individuals, governments, workplaces, health systems, and community organizations to increase the connection in people's lives. That's a lot to tackle. And when we take one step back, how connected are we in our own lives? And of course, the pandemic had a big impact on this. But I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm 77. I lived in a neighborhood of a string of row houses. There was a bunch of kids. We jumped out in the morning in the summers and on weekends, and we ran over. I lived right across from a schoolyard, and we played baseball and basketball. There was a soda store at the corner, next block, and there was a place you could have snacks, and there was a place you could shop for cold cuts and things like that. We had a little village. And one of the innovations in urban planning now that people are suggesting is to have micro cities, including Paris, where they say you should be able to live a completed life where you can get most of your needs met, have a place to rest and recline and maybe go to a park and talk to people within a mile radius of your house. So that was something that we had when I grew up that we never thought twice about. And now it's like a futuristic goal that people are fighting for in urban planning. And if you think about it, in most ways, we're farther from that now, than certainly when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, but than we've ever been. I mean, we ordered things to be delivered. People give examples now where now when you order food in, you don't even have to actually see the person who delivers the food. You're completely isolated. And people, I've heard people now, everybody thinks, well, we've legalized marijuana, more or less. But there are people who are not disease nuts, who are not anti-drug nuts, who are saying things like, perhaps we've missed the boat. When we look at young people and we look at our clients nowadays, we see all kinds of mental health encumbrances. We see all kinds of unhealthy use of drugs, marijuana combined with alcohol. And we see an incredible amount of isolation among young people. Somehow, despite Norman Garmesi's halcyon call for the future, in those 50 years since he announced that we were going to cure mental illness, society has moved in a whole different direction, which has enhanced mental illness, mental disorder, and addiction. And so I just want to tip my cap to Vivek Murthy, who's somebody who was at last finally said, well, let's focus on what the actual problem is. And here are policy recommendations to address that.